I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Tim Atherton. Tim earned his PhD in physics at the University of Exeter in 2007, and then came stateside and postdoced at Case Western Reserve University and joined the faculty at Tufts in 2011. Some of you got to see some of the very cool soft matter work earlier in the day. I learned a lot, which was very fun. But today, he's going to talk to us about LGBT physics work that he's been doing for quite a number of years now. I like, you know, how you Google people before you have to introduce them. I learned a lot about Tim on the Google today. In 2015, he won the Cottrell Scholar Award, which recognizes outstanding teacher scholars engaged in innovative research programs. Seems like a super cool program. And I also personally know of some excellent PER work that Tim has done in designing courses on computational physics, which is very exciting. In 2014, he was the Out to Innovate LGBTQ+ Educator of the Year, which is so cool. And then in 2016, he served on the ad hoc committee from the APS on LGBT+ issues, and launched the study, the results of which we are going to see today. And then on a very personal note, I don't know, Tim, if you even know this, you are the first out physicist I ever met, and I was a third-year graduate student at APS, and so Tim has a very special place in my heart as well. So let's give him a big round welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Sarah. That was really wonderful to hear. I'm going to talk a little bit. I think I am going to turn myself down just a little bit more. Yeah, that's much better. Oh, whatever you like. Yes, I think it's probably a good idea, Tom, actually. Let's bring it down just so that people can see. I'm going to talk about, one of my projects, which has been to understand the experiences of LGBT people in physics. This has been a decade-long effort, I would say. It's much bigger than me. It involves a bunch of people crossing many kinds of institution from, and many parts of the country, even international people as well. So a real powerhouse of excellence. And it's been done in collaboration with the American Physical Society and the American Institute of Physics, which are our professional organizations as well. So really couldn't have happened without them. So the other key person in this study, Ramon Barthelemy, is a physics education researcher at the University of Utah. He's an assistant professor. He gives an amazing talk, so I would definitely consider inviting him. Both of us, in my case, I'm a little bit old for it, but I try to do it anyway. We both tweet, so we're active on Twitter. You can see us at Soft Matter Theory and Ramon Barthelemy. I use he, him pronouns. Now, before I get any further, let me try to just make sure there are a couple of definitions. One thing that one thing that I appreciate is that when we talk about language in this area, and when we talk about diversity and inclusion issues more generally, there's quite a lot of jargon, and so I just want to make sure we're on the same page. The first is that many of you will have encountered some permutation of the LGBT+, GLBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQIAA acronyms. These are all umbrella terms that are aiming to capture various aspects of sexual and gender identity, and they're in different orders and they have different letters to try to capture broader and broader members of the community, try to really kind of capture the diversity of human experience. When we're talking about something as complex as who we're attracted to, what kind of life we're living, projecting this into words is obviously a very challenging effort, and we have to make some decisions. For this study, we chose to use LGBT+, The plus here kind of trying to indicate, that we really want to try to capture everything possible, nonetheless, going with an acronym that would be immediately familiar to everybody. So that was sort of what we did. And then I'm going to talk about a second thing, which is the climate. What is the collection of experiences that we live in our workplace, in our professional environment, in your department at Brown, in my department at Tufts, physicists across the country and the world. And I want to kind of sort of make a point here that, when we're being scientists, or as we're scientists, one of the things that we're focusing on is the kinds of knowledge that we're producing. We're interested in, what are the papers we can write? What is the new theory we can come up with? What is the new data that we can collect? And how do we link that data to theory? We're interested in scientific products. And as we're producing those, many of us would like to believe that the things that we're doing as scientists are somehow kind of a bit independent of us as people, right? We would like to believe that scientific knowledge is robust against changes of experimenter or changes of theorists, right? And I think that to an extent that's certainly true, although certainly our experiences affect who we're trying, the questions we might be asking or the methods we might be bringing to bear. But nonetheless, I want to think that even if we can agree that the scientific products are independent of people, the process by which we go about them and the kind of environment that we're living in as we're doing science is very definitely not. And this is really the place that I want to bring in. Now, a little bit about my own story. So, when I was a postdoc, I just got my PhD and I was about to leave Britain, I was wondering what kind of environment will the US be like? I have no idea, right? One thing that was immediately a challenge for me is that my boyfriend at the time, Mark, it was very obvious that we couldn't go together, right? Because I needed to get a visa to come to the United States. Many of you had to get visas to come to the United States. There was no possibility for my boyfriend to get a visa, right? And so we split up, right? So I made that decision, and I think it was perfectly for the best. But at that point, that was the point that I realized that actually who I was definitely was having a role on my career. In any case, whilst I was a postdoc and then at a visiting assistant professor at Tufts, I actually didn't think very much about my orientation. When I was outside the physics department, I was living my life. When I was in the physics department, I was being a postdoc, right? And that's great. And then a visiting assistant professor, and I taught my first class, and it went very well, actually. At the end of that class, I got this email who said, this was from a student, he said, "Thank you for a great class." He said, "Your support of gay rights helped me find the strength to stop living in silence." He said, "Thank you for being a professor. It was a pleasure to talk to you." I got this email. And, the student said, basically, "Thank you for being out." And I was like, but hang on a second. I didn't do anything. I didn't know I was out, right? I had no idea. And so the second thing I thought, and, I hope that, I think many of you at this wonderful institution have had emails from students expressing their gratitude to you as professors in various ways. I think I wanted every one of my students to feel this inclusion, to feel this joy of being a physicist, and to go on. This sort of was a moment for me where I realized, well, actually, I want everybody to have a great experience in my classes and in my research. Now, I wasn't the only one thinking along these lines, and so a bunch of us together, we Particularly, I would like to thank Els Long on the right in that upper left photo. She really kind of was one of the people who, when we went to the American Physical Society March meeting, started asking questions like, when you're doing diversity stuff, how come there's nothing for LGBT people? And as a result of her kind of asking that question and a bunch of other people asking that question, we were able to convince Kate Kirby, the president of APS, she's second from the left in that photo, to sponsor an ad hoc committee to look at LGBT issues. We met over several times in the course of a year to study the issues, and we produced a report. We did a survey. I'll talk a little bit about the survey that was then launched at the APS March meeting in 2016. Center at the bottom photo is another very influential person, Michael Falk, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins, is now Dean of Engineering at undergrad education in the engineering school at Johns Hopkins, and was the chair of that committee. Very, very wonderful person to work with. So this is kind of, this is sort of my number one kind of, if you want to know more about this, you might want to look at this guide. This is the American Physical Society's guide for creating climate in physics. You can see the people who were involved in preparing it. You can see that myself and a couple of other Tufts students are on the cover. This was because the 2 days before publication, suddenly we realized we needed photos for the cover, and so I just rounded up some Tufts undergrads, and they were very kind and agreed to be part of it. Els doing her experiment on the right, I just think is a wonderful photo as well. So why should we study the experiences of LGBT physicists? Well, one thing is that actually they're a surprisingly high fraction of the population. Is that firstly, when the American Physical Society asked its membership, some 4.5% of physicists overall identified as LGBT. Now, this number grows significantly. If we ask early career physicists, on the same survey, some 15% of early career physicists are identifying as LGBT+. If we start asking the broader population, everybody in society, not just physicists, it may be that as many as 1 in 6 Generation Z adults identify as LGBT. This is a much higher fraction than people at different generations. What this means is that, as new generations of students come into our classrooms, there is this demographic that has very specific needs and very specific experiences, of which really, up till now, almost nothing was known, to be fair, right? And so, I don't know about you, but when I'm thinking about preparing my class and really making it engaging and making sure that I'm supporting all of my students as well as I can, I really want to have as much information as I can to help me do that. That's a reason to do it. The second thing is that, in our reports, by listening to the experiences of many LGBT physicists, we found that there is a significant fraction that experience various kinds of harassment in the professional environment. Obviously, that's very concerning. We all want to have a supportive workplace, and so we need to do something about that too. So, what did we do? Well, firstly, we did a mixed methods approach. So what this means is that we did a survey of over 300 LGBT+ physicists, they were recruited online by what's called a snowball sampling thing, which means we give the survey to as many people as we know, and we invite them to pass it on to other people. So this is what we do. And then we also followed up with some interviews of 5 individuals who had particular intersections of identity that we wanted to explore further. So this kind of mixed methods approach is quite common when looking at diversity, and it kind of helps give us both quantitative and qualitative information. The data was collected in 2016 as part of the APS ad hoc committee and was presented from the report. I'm going to show you a little bit more information that is in the report and actually stuff that has now emerged as we've completed the analysis for the paper, which came out earlier this year. So before I do that, let me kind of tell you about some of the things we asked in the survey. What kind of data are we collecting? Well, one thing is that we're asking about how comfortable do people feel in the workplace. We did that because comfort is a good proxy for all sorts of things. If you ask that question, we've seen, it's been previously seen to be a good measure of assessing people's experiences in their environment. We asked people, had they observed or had they experienced any form of exclusionary behavior in the workplace. We didn't try to define exclusionary behavior. We simply asked the question, and then we asked people to give examples if they had. We asked people to talk about their outness. We asked people to talk about how they felt about policies that might be in place in their workplace. We collected demographic information, and we also asked people or invited people to share free responses if they so wished. So that's kind of the methodology that we adopted. And so I'm now going to present some of the key findings from the study, and present a little bit more data as we go. So the first finding is that LGBT physicists' climatic experience, what happens to them when they're in physics, tends to cause them to either leave the field or at least consider leaving the field. That actually squares with my observation because almost every LGBT physicist I've ever known has left physics and is now doing something else. The second thing is that people with additional marginalized identities, that could be along gender or racial or some other axis, they're experiencing more hostile climates. That's what the data is showing. A third finding, which is very interesting because it gives some sense about mechanisms, is that when we look at people of color in the survey, this group is less likely to be out than their white peers. And that's a difference that we notice that I think is really interesting. So let me kind of present the data that is supporting each of those claims. So the first thing is that when we're looking at the question about their perception of comfort, we actually see what we did when we did the survey is we asked people to rate their comfort in different environments. It could be across the whole campus, could be in their department, could be in the classroom. We actually didn't see very significant differences between those three, but rather we saw a distribution similar to the above. So quite a significant fraction feel very comfortable or very comfortable, there's a minority, a significant minority, that are very comfortable or uncomfortable. And again, this is from the whole data set. We haven't broken anything down yet. So comfort is a significant variable, and experiences or observations of exclusionary behavior, you can see that a significant fraction have observed exclusionary behavior. These two variables together are predicting whether or not people have considered leaving the field. So that's sort of the finding number one. Again, this is where I'm going to lean on the mixed methods approach because we're seeing numbers and statistics here which are certainly helpful, but I think we can get more information if we drill into the qualitative data. So, this respondent talked about, this respondent was thinking about whether or not they wanted to get a PhD, and whether or not they wanted to was sort of contingent on whether they felt they had the right kind of support system in place. I think we can all resonate that because I think, as many of us know in this room, grad school is very tough. It's not easy. It's certainly, a challenge, right, to get a PhD. This student really felt that they would only be able to get a PhD if they had a support mechanism in place. Now, where things become, concerning is that, I showed you the overall breakdown of, people's perceptions of comfort, from the whole data set. Now I'm going to break it down by various groups, and we'll try to understand a little bit about how differences between different experiences may exist. So one thing that we can do is we can divide the population who answered our survey into 3 groups. And here we're identifying people who identified as men, people identified as women, and then we're grouping various kinds of people who didn't identify as a man or a woman into kind of one homogeneous block. We're doing that simply to kind of get a sense of it, to try to kind of be able to get some statistical power. But I think you can see the trend that if we look at comforts, women identifying participants are somewhat less comfortable than men participants, and gender non-conforming individuals are significantly less comfortable than male participants. Now again, what this kind of why might this be? What might people say? Well, one quote that I thought was interesting was, this respondent, she felt that she'd rather be a gay man than a straight woman. She felt that gender played a much bigger role than orientation from her experience. Now, I don't know that, other people might feel differently about this. Other respondents might have said something different, but you can certainly see, even from this quote, that, these multiple factors are combining. If we look at some of the other survey questions, such as experiencing exclusionary behavior or observing it, we also see this sort of gendered trend. So again, if people had experienced or observed exclusionary behavior, men were much less likely than women, who were less likely than gender nonconforming individuals. Again, what does it look like? So one respondent said that they were sexually harassed in their physics departments. Despite attempting to discuss the matter with other people, they were shut down, told that I was overreacting or misrepresenting the other student who was consistently given the benefit of the doubt in contrast. So obviously that person was not likely to go on to the next stage of their career. Another finding, again, cutting along another axis, are trans participants. And so here I've broken the data set into people who identified as trans on the survey and put everyone else into cis or assumed cis. And you can see, again, we're seeing a big difference in comfort levels between these two subpopulations. Now, again, what does this look like? This trans respondent said that they dealt with not having their choice of pronoun respected every day. And sometimes these situations affect me deeply on an emotional level and affect my ability to work for several hours. I think many of us can kind of understand that, having these kind of interactions, these hostile interactions, could really disrupt our ability to function in the workplace. So again, kind of that makes sense. Similarly, trans participants experienced and observed exclusionary behavior at significantly higher rates. So again, you can see the same trend. And what that looks like is, as one respondent put it, like if you ask them to either not use pronouns or to use correct pronouns, then they don't. They refuse to, and they'll talk about you a lot, so you hear them, or maybe they talk about me a lot, but it's not just in passing or oops, It's consistent conversations through the hallways. Just a couple of weeks ago, I'm walking out and they're like, oh, look, she doesn't even want to talk to us. So this doesn't sound like a healthy or positive workplace, where there is like a culture of gossip and not respecting people's, identity. So on to the second finding is that, maybe helping us kind of understand some of the mechanisms for this. What we see is that comfort is correlated with outness. So when we ask people how comfortable they are and how out they are, how they out to everybody, out to most people, out to some people, out to only a few people, or not out, we see two big kind of clusters. We see people who are out and very comfortable. We see people who are not out and very uncomfortable. I kind of want to remind everybody that the arrow of cause and effect is unclear here because, it could be that people are not out because they're very uncomfortable, or it could be that they're very uncomfortable because they're not out. We don't know, but nonetheless, you can see this sort of this clustering in the data. Again, kind of hearing some of the quotes from our respondents, some of them are saying, I don't know of any other out physics grad students. I know a lot of them are very conservative, and I feel like they respect me right now, but I don't know that they would respect me if I came out to them. So that's very interesting. Sarah mentioned that I was the first queer person that she had met in physics, and I can tell you that Michael Falk was the first gay man I met in physics. So I think that really resonates with some of us. The second respondent said they're not out at work because they don't feel comfortable outing themselves. They said there aren't any other out LGBT individuals in their department. There's a need for visibility in order for people to feel welcomed and included in the community. And it's that kind of visibility that the third person is talking about. They don't think that LGBT support is visible. They don't think it's absent, but I don't think it's visible in physics. So that's another kind of view. The third kind of, I think, big finding that is helping us understand the mechanisms is that when we looked at white participants and participants of color, we found some interesting differences in how out those people were to different groups. And you can see that participants of color on the right were significantly less likely to be out than their white peers. And this is kind of interesting because, one of the, as we've sort of said, support mechanisms are kind of crucial to success in physics. And maybe if people are less likely to be out to friends, family, or other kind of support networks, this might actually be kind of one of the causes for exclusion of these subgroups. So one of the interview participants said this, that I grappled more with the race element than with sexuality because the deal is that's what they see first. I can't closet my race because evidently I'm brown. And my hair looks different, so it's just there. That said, I think there's already a prejudgment there on the basis of how high my aptitude is. Anything that requires some level of critical thinking is always under examination or assumed to be mediocre or subpar. So this participant had obviously experienced this environment, and again, it's not surprising that they would question whether physics is a career for them. So I've shared data that I hope you will find concerning. Certainly, it raises questions about the climate that people are perceiving in physics. I think it's a threat to our ability to continue to recruit physicists into our profession. I think it is, I think we're losing out on massive amounts of talent if we're not creating a welcoming or supportive environment. And that's obviously a concern for the scientific enterprise. I think all of us here are here because we are excited about science. We're passionate about physics. And we really, really want people in our classes and in our departments to succeed. Like, why would we not? So we have to think about collectively, and I'll show you some of the things that have emerged as possible things we can do. But I think we have to think about ways that we can better support the particular subpopulations and some of the subpopulations I've described. So in order to address these things, we need to create a supportive climate for LGBT physicists. So one thing that we can do is and we can do it if we're not LGBT, is show our support. So this respondent said, I found 2 professors at my university who are okay working with queer people, and one of them became my thesis advisor. And the reason I could identify him was because he had a little rainbow sticker on his window, and I would see some of those, and it was a cue for me to be a little more comfortable around him in terms of talking about my family life or just opening up in general. So very happily, as I was wandering around Brown today, having lots of great scientific conversations with everyone, I was thrilled to see that some faculty have the little rainbow stickers from the Brown OSTEM group on their doors. And again, I would say, speaking personally, these little cues actually mean a lot to LGBT students. They don't mean that a faculty member is an expert on the issues. What they really mean is that the person concerned is showing a willingness to engage and a willingness to be open to learning. I think that's really what they mean. But even something as simple as having one of these stickers could actually just really shift people's perceptions of the climate, which is really great. Other things that we've done at every meeting, at every APS March meeting for the past 13 years now, wow. We've had an LGBT networking event. I've hosted many of them, I do so because I think it's important for people to have spaces for conversations about the issues arising. So in that context, one of the people saying, I think continuing to host everything that you can that helps, whether it's in conferences or newsletters. Here's how we're trying to diversify physics. I think even the act of trying to talk about the issues or show that your department or your institution has a commitment to a supportive working environment, I think that actually counts for a lot. And it's certainly a great starting place. Now, I think the other thing, that I think is helping is that, when people are out, it certainly helps us, it helps people see the humanity of the scientist. And I thought this person put it so eloquently. This person is trans, and they said, my school is very comfortable with a gay or lesbian person, but the complete opposite. And I think it's just not having dealt with as much the trans or genderqueer person. But when you see those people are just as successful and just as human, then I think that's where barriers get broken down. And I think that's a great reason for those of us in the queer community to be as visible as we can, given our career stage, because I think that kind of common humanity leads to a better understanding across difference. So, the key findings of the survey, I guess I'll just sort of reiterate that, climate is, and particularly a negative climate, is shaping people's desire to leave the field. One thing that's actually really interesting that I didn't mention that is worth stating is that it seems that observing exclusionary behavior is almost as damaging as experiencing it. As in, people were as likely to want to leave if they saw exclusionary behavior as if they had experienced it. And I think this is because unless department leadership, university leadership, and other people in the environment work to actively create a positive culture, then the question of whether the culture is supportive or not tends to make people think, well, okay, maybe it's not supportive, and then think about leaving. A very important finding is that, one of the things that's very popular in diversity work is to kind of cut people along one axis only, to think about how are we going to support queer physicists, how are we going to support women physicists, how are we going to support black physicists. This is quite a common approach, and I think you can kind of see why this can be a flawed approach. It can be helpful, for sure, in advancing various axes of climate, but because we are seeing that people with multiple marginalized identities are experiencing more hostile climates, we need to be paying attention to those intersections and ensuring where we're designing interventions that help support people, that we're actually addressing all of the needs of a person's identity, right? So we're not just addressing kind of one axis, we're addressing multiple. One quote I didn't put up here that I thought was really instructive is that, one respondent who'd experienced harassment said that she didn't know whether she was being harassed because she was a woman or because she was queer. And this was just, and so I think, if you're having a negative experience, you don't actually know what's going on necessarily, nor should you, right? And finally, there are these interesting differences between people of color and white people in terms of outness that I think are pointing to further work needing to be done, actually. So, the ramifications of the study are firstly that if people in the LGBT community are thinking that physics is a hostile climate, we're not going to be retaining them. And as I said, this is such a loss to us because we're losing immeasurable amounts of talent, especially as we're looking to oncoming generations where, as many as 15% may be identifying as LGBT. This means that we're losing out on a potentially vast number of people, which I think ultimately is undermining our shared goal to do the best science that we can. The second ramification, as I've said, is that if we design our interventions to just address one problem at a time, that's all very well, and those may be valuable and supportive, but nonetheless, these may not work for everybody in the population. They may not work for people with multiple marginalized identities. The third thing I think that's important is that, I hope I've convinced you that, this was the first study of its kind. It's the first study on LGBT issues in physics that was published. There hasn't been anything else. There's actually very little, published research on diversity in general in physics. That is something that is being corrected, and we're certainly seeing more of that. But we really do need to have a research program that illuminates these issues and helps us design evidence-based interventions. Because I think you'll all agree, we would like what we're doing to actually work. We want it to be fixing the issue. And we certainly don't want to be causing further harm. So, what can we do? Here are some things that we can do. So firstly, if you're engaging with students and your university offers a program like this, or like the OSTEM chapter offers a program like this, some kind of indication that you're open to, engaging with these issues, that you're trying, I think is a really great first step. Do it. Brown has an OSTEM chapter. I don't know how active it is currently, but I think that would be something to kind of check on, because these kind of OSTEM is an organization out in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It's a nonprofit that has chapters in many, many universities. And the idea is to provide a professional networking space for students, primarily undergrads in the chapter. And it's very effective, actually. We have a grassroots organization, LGBT+Physicists, that Ellen has started, and we have a best practices guide actually for departments to think about, how can we be as inclusive as possible, sharing kind of advice, so you can get the best practices guide. It's actually on the archive because we're physicists after all, there's lots of advice in there to help be inclusive, for both physics and astronomy. For the second edition, we're very, very grateful to have a bunch of astronomers come and help us and give some field-specific advice for that as well. Some of the things you could find there are how to create a welcoming climate in your departments or group, some things that you can do in the classroom to make your classroom more inviting. Some of these are actually really simple. So one of the things I do is I have a mid-semester survey in my class, and I just ask the students what's going well, what isn't going so well, what can I change, are you experiencing are you comfortable in this class? And I use the results to make adjustments. One of the pieces of feedback I got was that my handwriting on the chalkboard was terrible, so I worked on that, and the students said that they appreciated it. But I think there's some quite simple things that we can do, being open to feedback as well. Many of us are mentoring and advising people. We are advising undergrads, we're advising grad students, thinking about our mentoring and how, we might be, what we're doing to kind of really grow the people and help them have agency in their growth is crucial. When we hire people at our university, kind of following best practices in advertising the position, getting a diverse pool, ensuring that we bring in a short list of people that is really reflecting what we, the group, the department we want, and also for promotions, for tenure, and further promotions, ensuring that there's sort of best practices in line with there. Travel, there's some advice about travel, because, not all places are equally comfortable for various marginalized groups. People have really specific requirements. The American Physical Society actually has advice and requirements for their meetings to ensure that everyone is comfortable there. And finally, how do we convey that we've created a welcoming institution? So I just sort of said, if you're teaching welcoming language in your syllabus, establishing how your students want to be identified, using inclusive examples and analogies, so trying to just make sure you're drawing on, one of the things, so as an Englishman, I have to admit, as much as I like baseball, I found a lot of the baseball analogies really perplexing because I'm a rugby guy, not a baseball guy, So just make sure that you're not just focusing on one particular kind of example. You're trying to address a broad audience. If you see something problematic, it's good to try to intervene. A lot of us do not feel well prepared to do that, and so there is something you can do called bystander intervention training, where if you see someone harassing someone, or you see a problematic scenario, there are constructive ways to kind of intervene in that scenario, and that could really, because we know that these problematic scenarios are what is causing people to leave. If we as outsiders can kind of jump in and sort of, sometimes they're misunderstandings, sometimes they might be more sustained, Climate questions on midterm surveys are super easy, So I don't think any of this is particularly difficult, actually, and I don't think it's even very time-consuming, but even these small things could actually have a really big difference. I would like to sort of say, nobody can give you an answer to the question of what an inclusive classroom is, right? It's something that none of us know about. But one thing I want to offer kind of, from my own physics education research is that an inclusive classroom could look really different from a traditional classroom. And so in my computational physics class, this is from one of the iterations. The students are making oscillators, they're videoing them, they're building computational models, they're testing their theories against data, a shocking thing, of course, to happen in our classrooms, right? I mean, but, I think it's a really wonderful thing, actually. And, one thing that's happened in this kind of class that we've designed, it came from a project called Remaking STEM that was funded by the National Science Foundation. One thing that we found in this is that, firstly, the students actually do much higher level things than we would have tried to do. In this particular instance, the students got into multipole expansions of magnets, which is not something I've ever had much success trying to encourage students to do on their own. They dove into the mechanical engineering literature of the early 20th century to try to figure out models of bouncing, which, again, I'm not sure I would have ever expected them to do that. So this kind of classroom where the students have a lot of agency, where scientific practices are centralized, could be part of the solution. From the evidence that we've seen so far, they also allow people with many marginalized identities, many different, both individual and multiple, to engage with the material, productively and with good scientific outcomes. So, what I would say is that because we don't have good advice on what an inclusive classroom in physics is, there's real room for innovation here. And everybody here who's teaching a class could be part of that solution by trying something different and trying to figure out, is it effective or not? Is it helping or not? So you're all potential partners in this in this endeavor. I'd also like to just sort of note, for those of you who are not part of the LGBT community, one thing that we firstly need to say is we need you. If we are at most 15% of the population, nothing that we can do can be done without the support of non-LGBT people. We need you as allies, but that's not an overnight thing. You don't have to immediately say, I'm an ally. It's not something that you do as a one-time thing. It's a process, it's a destination, It's a process that you go through, not a destination, right? So you become an ally by supporting LGBT people in your environment, supporting other marginalized groups in your environment, and, ensuring their well-being and continuity in the physics enterprise. So this is where I will stop and thank the American Physical Society for the funding that made this possible, and to thank our wonderful, wonderful co-authors. The paper that I've just talked about the results from is available in PhysRev PER. If you just Google my name, you can find the paper. You can also find all sorts of media coverage and op-eds. And I'm very happy to field questions on this topic. Thank you so much for your attention. And sorry, the mic is a little iffy, so yeah.
The mic was fine. I wondered if there are plans for a longitudinal study where you'll repeat this.
Yes, thank you for the question. So I think it's essential to repeat this. There are several reasons it's essential, and not all of them are obvious, actually. So firstly, as I mentioned, the data was collected back in 2015, and I think we all appreciate that the environment in 2022 is just wildly different than it was in 2015. So many things have happened in the last few years. So firstly, a question is, are our findings robust, right? Do we see them again? We're scientists, right? So we want to know that our survey, our results are robust. One thing that is actually quite encouraging along that axis is that the Institute of Physics which is the British version of the American Physical Society, actually did a very similar survey just before the pandemic. They kind of actually reused a lot of our questions, which is a good thing, because by reusing our questions, they were able to compare. Despite the fact that Britain and the US are actually very different countries and have very different politics, things are not so similar as you might imagine. Nonetheless, they actually found many of the same things. They found the gendered effect, which is very interesting. They found differences in people of color and between trans and non-trans participants as well. So many of the findings that I've shown you actually have been proven to be robust, even in an environment as different as the United Kingdom. But we've obviously had a lot collectively that we've lived through. Some of the ways that it has impacted us, I think, have been really non-obvious. So one thing, as I was talking to queer people earlier this year at the March meeting in 2022, I asked the question, how has the pandemic shaped queer experiences in physics? What has it happened? Not everything was negative, actually. It was really interesting. There were some people that said, well, now that when I was working from home, I didn't have to interact with the wanky people in my apartment, or interestingly, working from home gave me more control about how I am presenting myself and how I'm being perceived by other people, and opened up room to experiment with that presentation, which I thought was really interesting and actually could do with being unpacked more, I think. So there could be, there's interesting things to look at there that, might have ramifications. So the simple answer is that we are currently trying to get funding to do it properly. But even if we can't get funding, we'll definitely redo it, But you have to sort of dangle the carrot in front of the NSF and hope they'll bite. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Any other questions or ideas? Yeah.
And thanks for all this. I'm intrigued by this snowball method of actually collecting data, and I'm just wondering if you could talk about that. I see that as kind of a really very interesting tool for getting to populations in various ways that is targeted and yet very kind of affirming at the same time.
Well, thank you for the question. So, one of the things that I think is really interesting is there's a lot of methodological issues that arise when you're looking at people who represent a very small fraction of the population, right? Well, even 15%, but even if you start cutting different subcategories, you're rapidly into very small numbers, right? One of those issues is how to get to people. How do we get the biggest possible sample? And so kind of in the community of social scientists who are researching these things, snowball sampling is quite a common technique. And the idea is that random sampling is just not going to do it for us. We're just not going to get a big enough pool. But if instead we kind of, we sample where we know people are and then encourage them to pass it on, we're going to get a bigger population that we can look at. And I mean, 327 is a pretty big number for a survey of this kind. It is very hard getting data, right? I mean, the American Institute of Physics conducts national surveys of physicists. Many of you have probably had emails from them encouraging you to fill it out. You may not have filled it out because we're all very burdened for time, but they only will allow you to do, you have to have a very high, it's kind of like getting a NASA experiment, right? Like you have to have a really convincing scientific case for why should this question be on the survey. So Yeah, so snowball sampling was basically a fairly low-cost way of getting a reasonable sample. Of course, you can legitimately say that we've now not got a random sample, so claims about significance, are challenging. There are kind of methods that you can do to address that. But this is really then in the domain of high-quality social science work, and we're pleased to collaborate with people doing that. Yeah. I see Brenda.
Great topic as well. So you mentioned a point of making sure that you recognize people's intersectionality
Yeah.
in programming. How do you suggest doing that? Right? Because it doesn't make sense to say you're plus and plus and you give it plus plus and then plus minus. So what's the best way?
I think that's a really great question, and I don't have like a canned best practice. But one thing I will say is I think again, a little bit actually goes a long way. And so, for example, a number of people, many people in the physics community who are women will go to a conference on undergraduate women in physics, right? And it's a fantastic experience for them. They sort of learn, it sort of helps them gain their network and think about their career. One piece of feedback that some of the students, some of the Tufts students who attended that, who were queer, was that program really didn't address any other aspects of their identity or really acknowledge them. So I think that the first order perturbation theory on that would have been to, say, look, this is a program for undergraduate women in physics, but we want to acknowledge that people are bringing other things to the table. Maybe there could have been an event at that program that was for queer women to network. Maybe there could have been, speakers from a diverse panel. Maybe there could have been women of color. Maybe there could have been queer women kind of on various panels, and that was sort of talked about. But none of that happened, right, for this particular QWIP. So I think that, the baseline is to just acknowledge those other identities and be really clear about what the program. The better version, and appreciating that this is not easy, is to have the voices of intersections of marginalized people that you really want to empower, engaging them in the design process and ensuring kind of their needs are met. It may be that when you're designing your program, some of the design is flexible enough that you can actually get information on the people who are attending, so that you can make adjustments. Certainly it's good for your program to kind of be listening or hearing, along those lines. So I think that really good design principles are something we all kind of are striving for. I'm happy to hear what people think works and doesn't, but I think those are kind of good baseline first ones. I will also say, something that happened over the summer that was just unbelievable, it was like an incredible experience, was that the American Association of Physics Teachers summer meeting, coordinate with that conference is the Physics Education Research Conference. And for the first time ever, that Physics Education Research Conference, co-organized by Sarah, actually addressed queer issues. And so kind of this intersection of queerness and kind of design actually was talked about quite rigorously by people. So I'd like to thank Sarah for incredible work on that. It was tremendously valuable. Yeah, engaging the education community, I think, is really helpful too. Thanks for the question, Brenda. Any other questions, especially from students as well? What do you all think? Go for it.
So one of the last slides we were talking about, if we as a professor, we can make classes more inclusive by having support labs. And I saw a lot of the data are focusing on the support group that we can have for students. I wonder if we ever did anything more of the
Do you want to know how much? So when I had my first class, right, which was Intro E&M, which I hear you were telling me about. You're amazing. Oh my God, it sounded great. When I taught my first E&M class at Case, the sum total of training I got was a 1-paragraph explanation of what the course was supposed to be about, and some notes, I kid you not, from the 1980s that a previous professor had made on the topic. I was very fortunate because on the day that I was reading through these notes and thinking, I don't know, a very kind and brilliant guy by the name of Doc Brown, who's a professor at Case, a high-energy theorist, actually is now a multi-millionaire because he founded his own company to make MRI machines. Absolutely wonderful guy, very passionate about education. He ran into my office and he said, I hear you're teaching E&M. And I was like, yes, I am. And he was like, let me give you some advice. And he was the person who first told me about physics education research. And he said, with a little bit of effort, with not much effort, there's actually a lot you can do. And so I was very fortunate to get really good advice from him on how to kind of do a good job without, as a busy younger person, like it not taking too much of my time. So I think that you're absolutely correct. I think that training is central to these things. And so one thing that we've done at Tufts is we now have a graduate TA training class it's like a 1 credit hour class. It meets once a week for an hour. I guess that's what that means in our units. It's a place to learn a bit about pedagogy, critically reflect on it, and kind of improve. One thing I will say, the most effective evidence-based intervention for teaching is, I would say very simply, peer observation. So even if that class doesn't exist yet at Brown, one thing that everyone can do is simply go observe another person's classroom and share with them, have a discussion about what happened, what was going on. I do this all the time. It's been tremendously valuable for my growth as a teacher. I've had the joy of helping a lot of faculty over the years kind of grow themselves as professors, by kind of, I asked them, well, what do you want to know, And one of the professors said, I want to know what all the students at the back are doing, And I said, well, I sat there for an hour and they were on Facebook and one of them was buying shoes and, and they're like, oh, and you know what I mean? Like it's really helpful information. One of those observations, someone said, you need to wait more before, I was very young, I asked a question, I would immediately answer it. I wouldn't give anyone time to think. That observation, the person said, look, I noticed that you would ask a question, there would be a couple of seconds, and then you just answer it. And that's why, maybe there were students who looked like they were ready to answer, but you weren't giving them the time, right? So that kind of feedback is so helpful to all of us. So I would say a culture of excellence, I would say peer observation. If there's room, I know we're all so busy, for it could be a pre-semester training or it could be like a class on pedagogy. All of those things would be amazing. Yeah, but you're totally right.
I want to be
we might be over
respectful
time,
of folks' time. So let's thank Tim again.
Thank you, everyone. I'm super easy to get hold of. If anything that if you saw anything you want to know more or talk more about, just email me. And thank you so much for being here, everybody. Thank you.